if you don't have a question but you have a comment, if you just want to state something that we could all ruminate over, that's welcome. But please keep them relatable and practical as much as possible. But we don't mind having people mention their 2 cents. That's part of the entire concept of why we're gathering here today. And also I want to say thank you to people that have asked questions. And if you're on Facebook, we're streaming because we know some folks couldn't be here and they asked if we could do it. If you're on Facebook and you've got questions or comments, please feel free to comment them. We have some folks watching and we'll try to get those addressed later on in the service. You should have gotten, as you walked into the building, a paper. There is one on a stand in the back and there's one here to stand in front. If you haven't got one, they're available. Just grab them whenever you'd like. Two-sided, it is a rough drawing of what we are considering of doing with our current church. Before we really get into it, I just want to give you a brief why on what we're talking about, and then I'll give you a what of what we're talking about. We have had a tremendous success over the last few years in our children's program. About 3-4 years ago, we were at 31 kids in our youth room. And just 2 years ago, before COVID, we were at over 30 kids regularly on Wednesday nights, which is an amazing thing to see, having all of these different families, some that frequent the church on Sunday, some that frequent other churches, but valued our children's program so much that they came to ours instead. It's an incredible thing to see and an opportunity that we don't want to waste. There's another feature that we've seen over the last few years, and that is the growth of small groups. We've had quite a few folks coming in at various times using the church to meet, discuss, and study out God's Word together. And that's been an amazing thing to witness too. What we have noticed, though, is that where we are space-wise does not consistently fulfill our needs. It's often that, whether in children's ministry and small groups, that there's a conflict of timing and struggle, who gets to use which rooms and what they get to do with it. And when it comes to especially some of the children's ministry and the youth ministry, confined space that has no air conditioning or heating is a very difficult place to put 30 kids. And so considering that and considering their active and knowing that we would like to include activity as a part of our children's ministry, we're looking at the possibility of creating a space where we could house a large number of children and or adults in a room that's designed for physical activity that could not just house a whole bunch of people, but also act as a secondary place of worship or fellowship. So I've just thought about ways we could use a building or things that we could do with it. And there's 3 areas of ministry that I feel really would be impacted positively by this concept in this church. One is our youth ministry. Our youth ministry desperately needs a youth building. I've heard both from teenagers and from youth pastors in the area that we have a strong, reputable youth group. I've actually heard it from the mouths of one teenage girl who said, "Your youth group teaches the best lessons and I learn the most there, but because it's confined and we don't do anything, I would rather go here." And that saddens me to see and hear that. And I heard the same from a youth pastor. He said, your youth group would be so much larger if you had a space to house those kids. So that puts a big burden on me just in that area of ministry alone. And I've got a lot of different suggestions on how to use the building if we had an extra space. But not just the youth and the children, as valuable as they are, our current church could use a little extra space. How many of you guys have ever assisted in the pasty making process? I know, good hands, yeah. I've seen quite a few tables set up, and I've seen on more than one occasion where they've had to use not just the fellowship hall, but branch out into the hallways to have enough room to make all of these things and to serve them. And we find that to be the case with other things, including the rummage sale and whatnot, where it's really tight for space for some of these major, unique events. And it sure would be helpful if we had another space or even just a bigger space that we could use, that it'll allow for more of that activity to occur and allow it to be a smoother and more successful activity. Beyond just the things that we already do, there are so many ministries that we could do, and I personally believe we should be doing, but that we can't do without a space like this. And I'm thinking of family game nights and movie nights where we've used the fellowship hall on occasion for those, and it's been helpful and wonderful, but the fellowship hall has its limitations, including a lower ceiling, so you can't play cornhole in the fellowship hall, There's certain things that would be very attractive for us as a group to connect with each other if we had the ability, time, and space to do it. And I also believe that there's some community ministries that we're lacking that I think would be excellent for us to pursue, especially some in the dramatic field. If we had a room that was designed and especially caters for dramatic presentations like skits or even murder mystery themed dinners and things like that, it would be a huge opportunity to reach people in the community that otherwise do not have interaction with our church. To be clear, I'm not suggesting we should build a building because we need more people or because the teenagers need it. I'm suggesting that we should purchase or look at this concept seriously because of the opportunity in ministry that lies in this. So that's the why. There's a lot of consideration that goes into more specifics on how and why we could use such a space. What I'd like to do is show you the what. So as we're expanding our opportunity, I would like to present you the rough drawing that we've kind of come up with the assistance of Ed Hunt, who is a fellow construction company owner. He has done work on this church and many others in the area, a good, strong Christian that we appreciate. And so we know him well, have a good relationship with him. He assisted us in this drawing. This is not a blueprint. We didn't purchase this. This is something that he assisted us and gave to us as kind of just a help. So what I'm about to show you, you'll have on your papers before you. There's two sides to that paper. Okay, one side shows a zoom out the entire church property, and then the other side shows a zoom in the layout of the proposed building. So yeah, if you don't have a paper, feel free to grab one. There's a stand in the back, and there's a stand in the front here that you can get some if you need them. So again, you should have two sides, one that says, one that's the entire church side, and the other that is zooming in. I'd like to start with the big side that has the whole church block. It looks kind of like this. You see the presentation of the church on there, and you can see where the sanctuary is and those things. What we would be proposing is a room, a building. It's an extension. It would be connected to this current building. So an extension off of both the fellowship hall and the downstairs hallway. So it would connect ideally to both locations into the lawn, and it would be roughly the size of the fellowship hall, adding about 5 feet on each side and 10 to 20 feet in depth. So it would be larger than the fellowship hall by several feet width-wise and by double digits feet in length. So that gives you hopefully an idea of the size of what we're talking about. That new building spot, that's where that would be. And then next to it, you see the words parking lot. Part of this proposition is also, it would include a paved area of parking so that we could have more folks who could park closer to the church on this side of the building. There would be 10 to 12 spaces that folks could park in and still have a circular round drive so folks could pull in, drop someone off, and keep going through. So there's some development as far as ideas that go that way, but please remember, this is all just an idea and a concept. None of this, any of this could change as was needed, if is needed. So that's kind of where on our property it would go. And then if you flip over your page and look at the actual building, you'll kind of see the idea of what it would look like. And most of it would be one room. Most of it would be one large room with a built-in stage. And in the back of that, a small kitchenette with a sink, as well as some bathrooms. Next to those, you'll see what would be like a cry room of sorts, or just an extra place for meeting. And that would be used just as a private place. On the bottom of there, underneath the stairs, you see a space for a room that could be used as well as for that, or for storage or whatnot. So there's a couple of rooms in the back that could be used, some bathrooms and a sink, but the vast majority of it would actually be one room. Another proposition that was considered, or that has been suggested, is that if this were to exist, the contemporary service could meet in that building, and the traditional service could meet in this sanctuary, either simultaneously or on a staggered thing, so that they could meet at the same time, but both have their own dedicated spaces. You wouldn't have, right now we're messing with several sound systems, and of course we have a whole bunch of instruments that are pulled up and on and things like that. We'd be able to clear some of the space out, use it completely for traditional space, and then likewise on that side use it primarily for a contemporary space on Sunday mornings. That's an idea. That's just a suggestion that was presented. Yes, you have can you just come up to the microphone, though, so we can hear you, and the folks on Facebook could hear you?
I'm Nancy Richmond. I'm a retired pastor and ordained elder. And my thought is, you're doing all this expansion of the building, but if you're looking at more people to come, you've got to have a whole lot more parking, or else add another service, because you're already filled.
Yeah, we are currently meeting parking needs. You see a lot of folks that are filling up this side, especially if there's two services at one time. Yes. This parking lot fills up real fast. You notice a lot of folks have been using the parking lot across the street.
And
what we would like to
up on,
yeah, and it fills quickly too.
Especially when the snowbirds are here, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in those months where everyone's together. With this extra parking lot, it wouldn't be enough to facilitate a whole extra group. But with 10 to 12 parking spaces, and you think an average of 2 people per car, that would take care of about 20 to 30 extra folks. We would especially try to keep that for folks who are handicapped space, because we know there are folks that park on the side of the road or that park over there that really we feel ought to be closer to the building when they park. And so that's one idea of having some of those extra spaces here. But that is a consideration, too, if you're going to have those staggered times of making sure we have the appropriate space for parking.
Yeah, and you have to time it right, too, or you've got everybody showing up, or while others are still there.
And obviously we only have one pastor, so it couldn't be at the exact same time because he has to preach to both services. So if they were at the same time, it would be more like, they overlap a little bit more so than they're at the exact same time.
So you've got 3 services and you're going to go down to 2, is that correct?
Currently we're set at 2, and that was in part due to COVID, but there was discussions amongst the leadership team to narrow it down to 2 at some point anyway.
Okay. All right.
Part of that was how much time is taken up of his schedule on a Sunday morning.
Well, and I could talk to him all day long.
Yeah.
So, I'll have to sit down and chat with you.
Okay, Nancy.
Because having been in many churches, I understand your issues.
Yeah. I appreciate the thought about parking especially, though. That is something that we would have to very well plan out, do some math on, figure out, is this something we really want to push as far as having that many cars all together and filling up the streets and whatnot. I do feel confident we could find some space or make some space, but you need to figure that out beforehand and not just assume it's taken care of. So that is something that we would have to plan out more so. Anyway, so that is the building in its most basic form. You have in front of you a picture, basically, of what is being thought up and considered and concepted. And you've heard a little bit of why we're looking at the possibility. Again, this may or may not happen. This is not a time for decision. This is just, a what-if session where we dream a little bit and talk about what could we do if we had this, and would we like to really pursue this? Is something that we desire to pursue, much less are we able to pursue it. So if you have questions or comments, this is the time. We want to hear from you guys as much as possible. This is the time to drum up some conversation. Again, if you just want to share your 2 cents, that's absolutely fine too. We don't mind.
Debbie Altman. My question would be, with the situation with the Methodist Church and eventually having this split, are we guaranteed that we're keeping this building, or is that being considered that we may not even be in this building?
It's a great question.
Let me go ahead and handle this one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So within the United Methodist Church, over the last 40, 50 years, there have been discussions around a number of different things in regard to our theological stances. And it's all come to a head, so to speak. In the last 5 years, there has been a decision for the church to separate. If you've been listening to the podcast, that'll give you a little bit more information. If you haven't, I encourage you to listen to the podcast. But separations in the church aren't abnormal. And regarding the property of the church, it belongs in a trust clause with the United Methodist Conference. So the church property belongs to the conference, and then on top of that, there's a lien against all of the United Methodist churches to ensure that pension apportionments are paid. A part of the protocol for separation through grace and reconciliation is that those churches that want to separate from the current church would be allowed to do so with all its assets and property in place. The General Conference was supposed to meet last year to vote on this. Of course, due to COVID, it was unable to meet. And then the General Conference, which is supposed to meet every 4 years, was supposed to meet this year, but it has now been postponed. Mm-hmm. And so it's being pushed back to 2022. So at this point in time, any planning that we're doing, any changes that we would make, when the protocol gets voted on and accepted, and probably 80% of the United Methodists around the world agree that this is the right thing to do. Once that's voted on and accepted, then each church will be able to keep their own property and keep their own assets. That way, each church can then separate into the ministry it feels that God is leading them to. That's a great question, Debbie. And in fact, just a little history from my vantage point, having come in the last 8 months. When I got here, I understood that this had been considered over the course of the last few years. There had been some discussion. In fact, there's been a person who's been willing to donate a significant amount of money toward the building of a space like this. But when COVID hit and when the separation, especially the separation between the new expression and the old expression, there was some pullback, and it was more prompt, or it was more prudent to take a let's wait and see what's going to happen. Now with the protocol that has been agreed upon by all parties within the United Methodist Church, with that having been sent to General Conference, and that is something we're just waiting to vote on, and I'd love to say that it's just a rubber stamp, yep, it's all going to go according to Hoyle. That doesn't always happen. So we took a posture of waiting, and now since that posture of waiting, the protocol has been presented. It's been pretty much agreed on. We just need to get to General Conference to vote on it. And after General Conference, again, if all goes according to Hoyle, then we will be able to walk away or stay within the United Methodist Church. That's a whole nother discussion item, with our own property intact.
So yes, as long as it's with that separation process. But if we were to try to do something outside of that separation, then it would be at risk. That's an excellent question.
Any other questions? Gary, you going to race him? Come on, Gary.
Yeah, you can
First of all,
finagle that.
I'm going to share an opinion, nothing to do with the questions, but in the last 50 years, I've had the opportunity through friends and activities to have been in a lot of different churches, not only in Knoxville County, but all over northern Michigan and many of the other cities. And in my opinion, I haven't seen a sanctuary that I think is any more beautiful than what we already have right here.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot. So, I guess I have 4 questions, but you already answered one. One question is, do we have any, what's the possibility of what the facility we already have of a major remodeling to develop the space you need? I'm convinced of what you have. I'm aware of E-Free Church out here, and they've got a gymnasium even.
Yeah.
So they got lots of space, and I'm very impressed with all the stuff I've heard of. And I know Newell's Rack quite well.
Well, the quick answer to that is before any of this was actually considered, 2 other options were. One is remodeling the current church we have. Can we make space with what we've got? And then 2 was purchasing space already created. Could we borrow or purchase a building that's already existing for use, maybe even if it's off grounds? And remodeling, unfortunately, this is a brick building through and through. And there's certain parts of that make it difficult, but precisely it's the height of the ceilings. If you've ever tried to play basketball or volleyball in a 10-foot ceiling room, you'll notice that the 10-foot rim is hard to put a ball in. And the concept of remodeling was one of the first things that we did because it just opens up wide space. It opens up space to be in. But there's a whole bunch of other avenues we'd like to use that require higher space, not just wider space. So that's one of the reasons why we went against or didn't go down that road as far. The other thing is, even if we did that, we're running out of space for other things. And if we remodel without adding on, we're going to have to take space away from someone else or something else, which just creates the same problem elsewhere. So that's really the main thing on the remodeling concept.
I'm going to ask my next 2 questions, then sit down, so here they are together. How much do we have in savings to fund this, is one question. The other one is, do we have any estimates of the cost for this facility?
Those are great questions. They obviously tie together, and I have I should have said this probably from the start, but we have done some budgeting as far as what it would cost, and with this specific type, and this is an estimate based on building costs and labor, as well as furnishing, so including putting in sound systems and carpets and buying chairs and things like that. That all goes into the budget as we consider this. And as we were counting it, we were somewhere around $1.2 to $1.5 million. Now, that's why it's taken so long to get to this point, just to have the discussion, because that's an awful lot of money. I won't share the whole story, but about 2 years ago, someone came to our pastor, then Pastor Dan, and wanted to have lunch with them. They did. And he said, has your church ever considered building on for the youth? And Pastor Dan and I had a few discussions, not a whole lot, but he said, you know, it's funny you say that. There is a couple of folks in the church that have had that idea. And he said, what would that kind of thing cost? And Pastor Dan said, well, it would cost at least $1 million. And this gentleman said, I could take care of half of that. We have a starting seed just out of donation, and he's pledged it. We have more than just a word bond of $500,000 to start with. That's beyond our savings. That's beyond what this church has in its own assets and what it can do in fundraising and anything else. So mathematically, what we're looking at is raising at the highest end about $1 million, and then on the lowest end about $750,000, about $750,000. So that is kind of where we're at as far as what the cost would be and where we are to start with. If you have paid attention at all, there's public information for the church, the financial reports and whatnot. And I'm not going to get into those and talk about which avenues there's room for and this and that. But there are some avenues in which we could use some starting capital with what we have saved already. Thankfully, this building is paid for, so we don't have to have as much debt that way. But there would be a hefty amount of fundraising if we wanted to pursue this kind of an action. But it is an amazing start to see that someone, before even hearing that it was something that someone was considering, had in mind this kind of gift for this type of project. So we saw that as a step of faith. We saw that as, wow, this must be a sign someone's telling us something. And so we took that pretty seriously, and that's when we started looking at budgeting more seriously, and that's when we started having conversations with Ed Hunt. So that, budget-wise, hopefully that answers your question. From a very generic point of view, that is where we're at and where we would need to be.
A couple of people have written in on Facebook asking what happens to the Memorial Garden.
Excellent question. Nothing, absolutely nothing. In fact, we're going to expand the Memorial Garden. It'll get more room. It'll not take any room away. Nothing, it will not be touched. And we're already talking about adding on space to put more space for the Memorial Garden. So the Memorial Garden would not have any kind of anything done to it. The only thing is that with the building, it would be in the lawn, so you have, I don't want to say an obstruction, but you have a large item that's in the lawn. But the parking lot that was suggested, as you can see there, would rim around the Memorial Garden. So the Memorial Garden would not be covered up, it would not be tampered with, it would not be obstructed or touched. We feel that that is a valuable asset to a lot of folks over decades that we do not want to even consider messing with. And in fact, we want to enhance that in some ways. So excellent question. The Memorial Garden would not be touched. In fact, it would be given more room.
Tom Mutton, and I have some comments and I have some questions.
All right.
I have been at least a little privy to some of the discussions about this building, and I think conceptually it's wonderful. Whether or not it's doable is yet a thing I think that we've got to discuss and see about. But I have to say one of my questions is probably inspired by someone on the trustees that I share a bedroom with, so I want to be sure to address this. And the question is, this probably would fit a whole lot better in southern Florida, but where does the snow go for all of the parking lots and whatnot? Has there been any thought about what we do here?
Yeah, so if you didn't know, when the winter months come, you can look out there, there's still a pile left. The snow that's plowed out of our parking lot here gets compiled into the lawn. And obviously, if there's a massive building there, then that means there's not going to be a whole lot of room to put snow there. One of the discussions, or one of the concepts that was suggested, because we had that conversation with Ed Hunt, and he said oftentimes when landscapers run into that problem, they haul it away, or they have it hauled away, or they melt it. But it would take a little extra creativity to figure out where to put it. More than likely, it's not going to be hard to find a place to put it. The trouble would more be that it would take some time to take it to those places. So if, for instance, instead of just pushing it around the corner of the building, he has to haul it, that means he has to put it in something and take it off, or we would have to do that on occasion. Or that we would have to put a new pile out here in our current parking lot where we perhaps were having the van and things like that. So that is a consideration that we still have to get a little more creative on to find the best answer. There are a couple of opportunities out there, but I'm not really satisfied with any of those as of yet, personally. I think we can find a better way to handle the snow removal.
All right, another question. What is the inside height that you're looking at in this building?
So the inside height is initially proposed to be a slope of 4 feet, with 16 at the bottom, 20 at the top. So that's not a very steep slope. That's a kind of more of a flat roof. I personally would like to see it a little higher, but the higher up you go, the more it's going to cost. And so that's something that would be affected in the higher level of the budget. You know, if we were able to raise the money, we would be able to go higher with the building. And if we weren't able, then we'd have to settle for a lower ceiling. To give you an idea of what that would be like, this TV, the bottom of the TV is about 10 feet. So if you were to go up to the top of this stream of lights here, that's almost 20 feet high. That'd be the highest point of the ceiling, roughly. Again, I think it'd be better if we were just a little bit higher, maybe even just a couple of feet, but that adds to the cost. So that's something that would have to be considered in fundraising and things like that.
All right, the next is just a comment that may be way ahead of things, but I still want to bring it up because I find $1.2 million to $1.5 million certainly a bit staggering, even when you consider the benefactor, his contribution to this. But I also want to bring up something else, that if the split in this church leaves us standing on our own, we do have another means to, I think, look at as possible funding for this church. And I guess I'm bringing this up so that there's maybe some other thoughts that take place rather than, geez, this is a big amount of money. But we spend an appreciable amount of money on mission shares. And mission shares, if we're not part of the church per se, maybe that's an area where some funding can come from. And I don't want to bring up those mission share numbers, but they're big numbers, and they would make a significant difference over a period of 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
So.
There's no doubt that there's some areas that we could restructure our current church budget to facilitate raising some money with in-house already the way we are doing. But this kind of thing would not be able to happen unless people are going to step out of the pews and give in large sacrificial amounts. And that's something that we're going to have to consider personally and individually. It's amazing to see one person step out and say, I would if, or I will if. But it takes more than one. And it would be asking a lot, especially during this time. I know a lot of folks have struggled and suffered through COVID, and that's not been kind to our church, much less people. But that's what it would take. Again, that's why we have to have the discussion. That's why we have to ask ourselves as well as each other, is this something we're prepared to take on or we're willing to take on?
And one other difficult question that's in the back of my mind. I know, Jordan, you're really invested in this building, and I can understand why. And, and if this church were to go forward with this, would it be appropriate to understand where our, how do I want to put this? Where our religious support is going to come from for this building? You're immensely talented, and if this building gets a go-ahead, I think we've got to know who is going to be in this building and who is going to be holding these programs for these kids.
Well, that would definitely be something that we would lay out per, again, with the why. It would be an area where the youth would have priority. It would be a room where on Wednesday nights or Monday nights, whatever children's ministry nights we have, they get first dibs on the room. When they're not in the room, anyone else could use it as any other room, any other feature of the church, just like any room currently would be. Currently, just to give you an idea, one of the instances that we're struggling with even right now is that on Wednesday nights, the children's ministry meets in the fellowship hall. But as you know, there are various events, including the soup luncheons right now, that take up the space of the fellowship hall and make it difficult to use it in any kind of active fashion or any kind of fashion that would be conducive for children. And it's just not all that, conducive to have to bring up and put down tables and not have a ball in the room because of the ceiling tiles and things like that. So this would be a space where none of that has to be worried about anymore, but that at the same time, both could use the room. It's more about priority. So to answer your question, who's using the room? The children of this church get first priority in this room, the youth and the children's ministries. But it's for everybody. And for the community events, just like any other room in this church, someone that outside of the church wanted to use it, which they sometimes use our sanctuary or our fellowship hall already, they would have to go through the same process, go through the office, get clearance for why they're using it, when they're using it, and all of those kinds of things.
I've served a lot of the small churches and filled in for pastors and so on. So I'm familiar with the smaller churches as well as this. And the small churches are already struggling.
Yeah.
What are they going to do? And are they going to want to come with their congregation here? Or is that something that they're just going to say goodbye?
That would be a nice predicament for us if those churches in the area that have determined that they're no longer self-sustaining want to, as a church, join with us or become a part of the church here. It would be like the Israelites. They allowed the foreigners to be grafted into the Israelite nation, what God was doing there. We don't have the means of knowing whether that would happen or not.
It's too early to tell on a lot of things, isn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. There has been talk in recent years for the Alba Church.
Yes.
Because of their small size and their current status and everything else. And they have their own building. But they had struggled with keeping a pastor, and we're thinking about rotating pastors even from this church. And there's been a lot of discussion. And that's all that this is discussion. We're not proposing anything for a legitimate purpose. But there is the possibility of that if we were to search that out. But that's not something that I would put my foot on and say that's something we can do or use.
This goes to the big gun here, see. He gets to take that part back to the powers that be and have the discussion there. Some of this stuff is going to have to go there for decision.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing is going to have if this were to ever go down the road. Yeah.
Been there, done that, yes, I know. So, so have you started thinking of in that direction of how you're going, you've got a whole lot of stuff to worry about besides the building. What about all the people coming here just for the services because their church is meeting here? Or did they need to be in a church or whatever? So you've got a whole lot on your plate. He's got the building, but you've got the people.
We've got the people.
You've got the people, that's for sure. And you could find yourself really filled up too. And that's not a terrible thing.
No. Which it would then be handy to have some extra space.
Yeah, you can't be bored in this.
Yeah, that's true.
So, another question came in. We've talked a lot about the capital costs.
Yes.
Have we looked at what it means for operational costs over and above?
Excellent question. And this is something that's been proposed a couple of times to me already. And the truth of the matter is, unless we get a little bit deeper in, it's going to be really hard to establish what that cost would be. I will say this, having had a conversation with Tom Lisvan, we feel that some of the heating assets of this church would be able to furnish or heat another room or building such as that. So we wouldn't have to purchase necessarily another furnace and things like that. So there's some areas where we could get away with some of those maintenance costs from the start because we already have some assets that way. But depending on how often the church is used, the heating bill is one that would be difficult to really ascertain how much it would cost because it's tough to say how many nights a week it's being used and all of that. As far as janitorial crew, we wouldn't have to hire anyone new or anything like that. It is a large enough space that we might have to add some extra hours to our current janitors' situation that as they clean the church. But being one big room, it's a little bit easier to manage than to have 6 or 7 smaller rooms. Those sometimes take up more time. So some of those costs are being considered. And then just in general, the cost of maintaining it, like not just in cleaning, but in air conditioning and carpeting and cleaning the room and those deeper things. We would be able to use the fellowship hall as a guide as to how often we would have to have those things occur probably and how much it would cost. So as far as maintenance costs, I just can't give you even a ballpark. But I can say that we've sought some of these things out, and that if we were to go further down the road, we can get closer to a real number on some of those things as far as how it would affect our current budget weekly.
And that's good. If you're watching online, feel free to, in the comments section, ask questions. Any other questions that you might have? Afternoon, Mason.
Mason Buckingham. Our future are these kids. We can't stand still. We either move forward or we move backwards. I think we need to do whatever we can to move forward and trust. So I think it's a great thing to be considering, and I share ideas for the need. And I hope that we can come up with the money to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mason. Any other thoughts?
Gary.
Couple more things here. I'm going to kind of elaborate on what Tom was doing here a little bit, I think, unless I misunderstood him. We've had several youth pastors here in the last several years, starting all the way back when my son was in high school. But they all have been Jordan Chambers. And so if we go into something like this is something that I have a lot of confidence in. But if if you get a promotion or a chance to leave, can we get another Jordan? You think so?
Yeah.
The
Yes.
majority have not been Jordans.
Let me tell you,
That's the one question I have.
this is not. I am very passionate in that I believe this is what this church needs. And whether I'm here or not, this is the step the church needs to take, in my opinion. I would be just as passionate in pushing this and supporting this and encouraging this church to take this step, regardless of whether I'm here or not, because this is what I see as, not to play off the heels of Mason, but I see this as a way to maintain the church, not just in numbers, but in ministry. I think if we're going to grow at all in numbers or ministry, you're going to have to take some drastic steps. I think this is probably the best one to take, personally. And I would hope that if we were to all go down this road together, that regardless of my situation, that this church would understand that, see the value in it, see the need, pursue it just as hard. This is not my baby. I have a passion for it because I certainly believe that this is what the church needs. But my desire is to see everyone else see that same passion. I wouldn't want the church to pursue it if it's just because Jordan says so.
Then the other, just a comment that you've already got one person who has made quite a promise.
Yeah.
But I guess I have faith that there might be some more out there ready to step in there too. So I think we'll have more than one.
I will not make any assumptions or speculations, but I have no doubt, again, you see a sign of faith like that where a third of the building is offered. I'll say this, I've seen churches start with a whole lot less for a whole lot more. I've seen a church take on $1 million project with less than $100,000 to start, and it worked. It's more about determination and pursuit and self-sacrifice than it is anything else, and faith. And I really believe that if this church understands and wants those ministries to happen and occur, and it pursues those ministries and dedicates itself to pursuing and passionately following in faith those ministries, that God will bless and that God is faithful beyond even our imagination. But I'm not going to make any assumptions. Oh,
Or we'll
thank you, Bill.
restate.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Last one, I promise.
That's okay.
All right, so now you've introduced this to the congregation. Where do you have to go from here?
It's an excellent question. What's the next step? Me personally, I would really like to see verbal or written understanding of support. And that's just not, like I say, someone raising a hand, yeah, I think this is a good idea. I would like to get an idea exactly of people who are willing to put their name to say, I think this is something we should pursue. If we can gather that and see whether or not this is something that the church would like to pursue, as long as that is the case, the next step then would be to purchase blueprints. We have quotes. There's a gentleman in Saginaw, and he has provided quotes for legal assistance, blueprints, 3D visual presentation so that we could get an entire glimpse of the whole thing before it even is built and things like that. Plus, again, recurring assistance in zoning and legal fees and all of that for just over $8,000. And that would be the first major step of making any kind of purchase. This purchase, by the way, would be, you'd pay the price, but his fees and his services are permanently in our luxury, so that if we were to build this building 10 years down the road, and we could still use those same blueprints, he would still work on the services just as if it were the same year he gave them to us. So that's something to consider in that. But financially, the first step to take is to purchase those blueprints and to really consider exactly what we're talking about, what we're allowed to do with zoning. There's some things to consider as far as water drainage and things like that you have to really get into. That's a little boring to talk about, but it's rather important when the winter comes and whatnot. And so some of that's really the first step. But before any of that happens, I think we as a congregation need to come together either in a different meeting or in a different medium and decide individually whether or not this is something that the church is willing to pursue. I personally am very much for it, but I would never cast my support for going forward unless I knew the majority of the church was behind it. I feel it's that important that everyone's on board. This is something that everyone's got their hand in. This is the church that we're talking about, not just something else. So that's I think the next appropriate step to take is maybe have another meeting separate from this one where we can organize and determine where the support value is. But I think at a later date, because it would be good for folks to ruminate, maybe have more questions answered, and give us time to answer some of the questions that have been asked.
Kathy Elsesser. I just have a question, and this is probably from the finance, but I wonder if we could be transparent with the church as far as what we have for debts at this point and how our money's being spent at this point, what is needed, and then what is beyond that debt that we have at this point to spend on it, and then how much we would actually be raising money for.
Again, I don't have a financial report before me. It's public information, so you're allowed to look that up. I believe if you go to the church office, they'll help you with that. I can't really tell you a whole lot. I think the only thing I could really be willing and able to tell you is that over the last several years, we have financially been above our debt. So we have not, within the last few years, been below the debt line. In other words, our gains have been greater than our expenses consistently over the last several years, including through this COVID year, with some help from governmental assistance. But we do have some high expenses. We do have some things that are specifically designed to help us with our capital. And there are certain groups and areas that have a large amount of savings that we could definitely go to different various groups. Again, I wish I could give you a whole lot more information. It's not that I'm not allowed to, it's more that I don't want to give you false information. So I'd rather that you go to the office or call the church office. Don't do it all at once. But they will be able to supply some of that information if you're curious. I will say this, by the way, we have grown financially. We have been able to increase some of our finances over the last 5-6 years. But as long as I've been here, we've seen a steady decrease in attendance. And I do not believe that this is because people don't like the church. Largely, it's in part because we've seen so many folks pass on. We saw over 20 in our last All Saints Day. And it's difficult to go through that, but it's something that we must realize is that part of this church is something we expect to happen, is that we lose folks through the passing on of this world into the next. And we have a responsibility to fill those gaps.
Before you ask your question, Nancy, as I understand, the only outstanding debt this church has right now is for the parsonage. Isn't that correct, Rich? So the parsonage is the only current outstanding debt or mortgage that this church currently has on its books. All other expenses are operational. Yeah. Nancy.
You've got a ton of things to think about, and that's understandable. The building by itself is something, but with the splitting of the United Methodist Church, we're no longer going to be united if it all goes the way they're talking.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, there's a lot that we don't know. So there's a lot you can't really get started on, can you?
So what we do know is that in the separation, there will be churches that remain in the post-separated United Methodist Church, and then there will be churches that will be going to a new traditional expression. Regardless of which way this church goes, there will be a connectional system for the church. We're not going to become an independent church. We're still going to continue to be Methodists, but in a traditional format, which I think we already are, or in a post-separated United Methodist Church. Again, no vote has been taken. There have just been discussions. But we'll still be a part of a connection, and in being a part of a connection, there are still advantages to that also. But on the other point, we don't know what the timing is. Right now it's 2022, and the question then becomes, do we make a decision now or do we wait? So those are questions we wrestle with.
There's also the question of when to start. If for instance, we were just magically to come up with all the money within a few weeks, and we were just ready to go, there is a timing
You
of...
mean prayerfully come up with the
Yeah,
money?
prayerfully. That's a better way to say it.
There are people that are always going to be ready to jump in to help, but they aren't always the money people. And we have to remember that everyone is going to want to be part of this, regardless. They may be able to give you $1 or $1 million or anything in between. The $1 million would be lovely, but who knows? So it's just a matter of time, and we need to be patient is the big thing, isn't it?
Well, and that's what I was going to say, is that beyond whether we were able to start building right now, there's a question of what time of the year we want to start building based off of building costs and labor costs and things like that. A lot of consideration goes into when steps need to be taken. Again, with the blueprint, if we were to all approve within just a short amount of time to go down that road and to purchase that blueprint, which would be a hefty cost, that is one step that we could take without having to worry about making that next step. You know, we could wait on the next step several years, and it would still be a good asset, you know, as far as the thing goes. But the one thing that I would hasten, caution against is that if you elongate steps, you elongate the process, that really dampens the effectiveness of the process and maybe even the success of it. So I think it'd be wiser to wait until everything is really able to build all at the time. You consider what the cost will be.
And costs are higher now with all the ADA stuff.
Yes, yep, building costs are higher. We have actually considered this. These numbers were presented about 2 years ago to Ed Hunt. We know that building costs have risen since that time. So we asked him again, does this affect the budget? He told us we could assume almost the same budget nonetheless because labor costs have differed. And depending on when you build and because of the large type of manufacturing, this shouldn't be such a problem to have to deal with. So our budget should still remain the same, even though building costs have gone up. If you gone to Home Depot lately and purchased wood or paint, you'll notice some of those kinds of things. But
add about $1 million to what you think you're going to need, because when they get ready to build, that extra $1 million is what they're going to be looking for. Reality check.
Thank you, Nancy. Any other questions?
is there any questions specifically on the why? I want to make sure that everyone's very clear on the purpose of the building. Not just, because it's very easy to get caught up in, they want to talk about this. Well, let's get all the practical questions. And those are important. But again, we need to be all of the same mind as far as what such an asset could do in a ministry perspective. And I want, hopefully, that picture to be very clear. I don't want there to be any confusion. So is there any questions specifically in that area? Because that is one that I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page with.
Okay.
I guess to conclude, I would like to just share with you a biblical thought on why this should go through, from my opinion. I'm going to share a quote with you from Oswald Chambers. I follow his words pretty carefully. And this is something that I read about a month ago, a few weeks ago, struck home with me in this whole thing. It said, if you are in love, you do not sit down and dream about the one you love all the time. You go and do something for him. And that is what Jesus Christ expects us to do. Dreaming after God has spoken is an indication that we don't trust him. And I personally, folks, don't want to be counted in that kind of a group. And I think that we have an amazing opportunity before us. Again, it costs, it's risky, and there is some important practical consideration to have before it. But I'm also reminded of the parable of the talents, in that Jesus shared the story of the man who had talents and gave them to his servants. And the servant who was given much, much was expected. And the one servant who decided to go bury his talent out in the yard and do nothing with it, he's the one that received nothing. And we have something, folks. We have a lot. And I think it's upon us to use what we've been given, and to even ask if God will give us just a little bit more so we can do even just a little bit more. But again, this is something we have to do. This has got to be a community mindset, not an individual one. So I would really love if you had, over the next few weeks, if you could just share with me your thoughts, either personally, privately, publicly, I don't care. I really want to know where all of you folks are on this. And again, if you have more questions, please do not hesitate to ask, because we need to be asking questions the whole way through as far as we go. At this point, again, it's just talk. It's just discussion. If it ever grows into more than that, it's going to be because everyone has discussed it and we've considered it together. And so that's what I would really like for all of us to do, and that's really my only challenge after today, is that you consider all of these things, ruminate them, pray on them, and ask what is being asked of this church, and if you believe this is the direction the church should go. Not can go, but should go. The can come later.
Just remember, it's all in God's hands, right? All right, let me pray for us. God, we're grateful for a vision that you have cast upon this church through various means. Lord, the possibilities are just unimaginable of the ministry that we could do, the people that we could help to be in ministry, as well as those that we can reach out to. Lord, give us your vision for this church. Lord, give us how it is that we can love you, and how we can learn Christ's ways, and how we can serve others through this potential avenue. And God, as always, we ask that you would be glorified in Jesus' name. Be with us as we go our separate ways until we meet again, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.